There's something kind of fascinating about the fact that people still cannot let go of the world of the Twilight Saga, Breaking Dawn Part 2, more than a decade later. And I don't even mean that in the nostalgic internet joke way, where somebody posts an old clip of Bella staring into the forest while a Paramore song plays in the background, and everybody in the comments suddenly remembers being 14 years old. I mean genuinely. There's a reason every rumor about a continuation instantly spreads across TikTok, Reddit, YouTube Shorts, fan forums. People still care about these characters in a very emotional way. That doesn't happen accidentally. Franchises survive because audiences feel ownership over them. And whether somebody loved those movies or spent years pretending they were above them, the emotional imprint stayed there. And honestly, when the first whispers about Twilight 6, the new chapter started floating around online, my immediate reaction was skepticism, not because the idea itself sounded impossible. Hollywood revives dormant franchises constantly now. We live in an era where studios revisit anything with built-in recognition because theatrical risk has become terrifyingly expensive. But Twilight always felt strangely complete. Messy at times, absolutely. Uneven? Definitely. Yet the ending of Breaking Dawn Part 2 had this finality to it. Edward and Bella standing in that clearing, the music swelling, the memory montage hitting longtime fans right in the chest. It closed the book in a way that felt emotionally sealed. So when this supposed new chapter trailer dropped, and everybody collectively lost their minds for 48 straight hours online, I sat there trying to figure out whether this thing actually understood why people loved Twilight in the first place, or whether it was just another studio-engineered nostalgia product wearing familiar skin. And the weird thing is, the trailer actually surprised me. Not immediately. The first 30 seconds almost fooled me into thinking this was going to lean way too hard into modern franchise aesthetics. Darker grading, faster cuts, bigger scale, more polished cinematography. There's this tendency now where studios believe older properties must be updated visually to match current blockbuster language, and sometimes that completely destroys the identity that made those stories resonate originally. The old Twilight films had this dreamy Pacific Northwest haze to them. They felt cold and damp and emotionally awkward. Even the imperfections became part of the charm. You watched those movies and felt like you were trapped inside an overcast memory. This trailer understands that atmosphere better than I expected. The opening shot alone tells you a lot about the direction they're taking. Bella standing at the edge of the forest near Forks, older now, calmer somehow, but carrying this exhaustion in her eyes that instantly communicates time has passed emotionally, even if vampires themselves don't physically age. That's smart visual storytelling because the franchise always worked best when it focused on emotional tension rather than mythology exposition. And Kristen Stewart, assuming the reports are accurate and she's genuinely attached here, looks like somebody reconnecting with a role instead of simply revisiting it for money. There's a huge difference. You can feel when actors return because a studio check cleared versus when enough time has passed for them to see the character differently. Her performance in the trailer has maturity to it. Bella no longer feels overwhelmed by supernatural chaos. She feels protective, experienced, slightly haunted. That changes the entire energy immediately. Then the trailer introduces the central conflict without fully spelling it out, which I appreciate because modern trailers have become allergic to mystery. Everything now gets explained through dialogue exposition and giant text cards. Here, they let atmosphere carry tension instead. You see fragmented shots, unfamiliar vampires arriving in Washington, Jacob standing alone in the rain, looking genuinely angry for the first time in years, Renesmee older now, and caught between worlds in a way the previous films only hinted at. And honestly, Mackenzie Foy being aged into a more central role might be the smartest possible direction for this franchise. Because if you really think about it, the original saga ended right before the story could naturally become interesting again. That sounds harsh, but hear me out. The emotional core of Twilight was always transformation. Bella, wanting immortality, wasn't really about vampires. It was about fear of change, fear of aging, fear of being ordinary, fear of losing connection. Once she became immortal, the story essentially stopped right when the consequences should have begun. That's where this sequel concept becomes potentially compelling. Renesmee represents a generation born into impossible expectations. Half human, half vampire, tied emotionally to both the Cullen world and Jacob's existence. There's actual dramatic material there if handled carefully, and the trailer seems aware of that. There's this moment, probably the strongest shot in the entire preview, where Renesmee walks through the Cullen house while hearing overlapping whispers from both humans and vampires. The sound design there is incredible because it subtly suggests she experiences identity differently than everyone around her. It's not over-explained. It's just unsettling enough to make you lean closer. That's what good trailers do. They create curiosity instead of simply selling spectacle. Robert Pattinson's presence in the footage is interesting too, because he looks noticeably restrained here. Edward isn't being presented as the obsessive romantic centerpiece anymore. He feels almost secondary emotionally, which actually benefits the story. The original films revolved around Bella's desire for Edward. This feels more like a family dealing with consequences decades later. And honestly, Pattinson returning at all would have sounded impossible 10 years ago. People forget how aggressively he distanced himself from Twilight after those films ended. He mocked them constantly in interviews, sometimes hilariously honestly. But time changes relationships artists have with career-defining work. Since then, he's built one of the strongest post-franchise acting careers in Hollywood through projects like Good Time, The Lighthouse, and The Batman. He no longer needs to prove credibility. That freedom probably allows him to revisit Edward without resentment. And weirdly enough, maturity may finally help this franchise emotionally. Because when Twilight originally exploded, the conversation around it became unbelievably toxic. People treated teenage girls enjoying romance fantasy like some kind of cultural crime. Critics dismissed the fandom constantly instead of analyzing why millions connected with it emotionally. Looking back now, you realize the backlash often said more about cultural attitudes toward female audiences than the movies themselves. Were those films flawed? Absolutely. But they also understood yearning in a way many polished modern blockbusters completely fail to. Twilight was sincere, intensely sincere, sometimes painfully sincere. And audiences felt that authenticity even when dialogue became awkward or visual effects looked questionable. The trailer for the new chapter seems to lean directly into that sincerity again, instead of apologizing for it. That matters. There's a scene halfway through the preview where Bella tells Renesmee something like, "Forever only sounds beautiful until you start counting what disappears." And that line genuinely caught me off guard, because it suddenly reframes the entire franchise through adulthood instead of adolescent fantasy. Immortality no longer feels romantic there. It feels isolating. That's an evolution. And visually, the trailer avoids one major mistake I feared: Marvel-style humor injection. Thank God. Nothing kills atmosphere faster than every emotional moment getting interrupted by self-aware jokes. Twilight always existed in heightened emotional reality. People spoke dramatically because the world itself was emotionally heightened. This trailer respects that tone instead of mocking it. The Pacific Northwest setting also looks stunning again. Real locations, real fog, real forests. You can feel moisture in the cinematography. Too many fantasy franchises now shoot inside sterile digital environments where nothing feels tactile anymore. Twilight always benefited from nature feeling alive around the characters. You notice that, especially during the final section of the trailer, no giant CGI army, no sky beam, no collapsing universe nonsense, just tension. Bella running through the woods, Edward looking genuinely terrified, Jacob shifting mid-motion near a frozen riverbank, Renesmee standing face-to-face with an unknown figure whose eyes glow silver instead of gold or red, and then the music cuts completely. That silence right before the title reveal is probably the smartest editorial decision in the entire trailer, because it trusts the audience to sit inside uncertainty for a second instead of overwhelming them with noise. Then the title appears. Simple. Cold typography. Twilight 6. The new chapter. No ridiculous subtitle overload. No desperate cinematic universe branding. Just enough to trigger recognition without feeling cartoonish. And sitting there afterward, I realized why this trailer works better than most legacy sequels already. It doesn't behave like it's embarrassed by the franchise. That's the biggest difference. A lot of modern reboots spend half their runtime apologizing for older material. They become ironic versions of themselves because studios are terrified Sincerity will look uncool online. But Twilight was never cool. It was emotional, messy, earnest, intense. The people who loved it because it made them feel something huge and overwhelming during specific moments in their lives. This trailer understands memory. Not just franchise memory, emotional memory. And honestly, that's much harder to fake than nostalgia callbacks. What really stayed in my head after that first trailer wasn't even the big reveal shots or the returning cast. It was the mood hanging over the whole thing. That strange emotional loneliness the Twilight universe always carried underneath all the romance and supernatural mythology. People sometimes forget how melancholy those movies actually were because internet culture turned them into memes for so many years, but go back and watch the original films again carefully. Almost every character in that world is trapped by time, memory, regret, or desire. Nobody in Twilight is emotionally free. Not really. And this new footage seems deeply aware of that history. You can tell whoever cut this trailer studied the emotional rhythm of the older films instead of just copying surface-level imagery. The pacing matters. There's patience here. Long pauses between dialogue lines, wide shots that linger slightly too long, characters looking at each other without speaking. Modern franchise marketing usually panics if nothing explodes for 7 seconds straight. This trailer almost weaponizes silence. That's why the reaction online became so intense so quickly. Not because people suddenly decided Twilight was secretly perfect cinema overnight, but because the footage triggered a very specific emotional memory for an entire generation that grew up alongside these characters. And honestly, timing matters here more than people realize. If this sequel happened 5 years after Breaking Dawn Part 2, audiences probably would have rolled their eyes. But over a decade later, the people who watched Bella Swan in high school are adults now. Some are parents. Some went through heartbreaks, marriages, divorces, relocations, identity changes. They understand permanence differently, which suddenly makes the concept of immortal characters emotionally interesting again. There's one moment in the trailer I genuinely cannot stop thinking about. Edward sits at a piano, not the exact same visual framing from the original movie, thankfully, because direct repetition would feel cheap. But the emotional callback is unmistakable. He's playing something slower, quieter, almost unfinished. Bella stands behind him, and neither character speaks for several seconds. Then she says, very softly, "She's starting to ask questions I can't answer anymore." That line changes everything. because the original Saga mostly treated Bella's transformation as fulfillment. The dream achieved, eternal love secured. But adulthood teaches you something uncomfortable. Every choice creates consequences that continue unfolding long after the emotional high disappears. Renesmee growing older, psychologically, while remaining biologically unique, creates tension the franchise has never explored before. And that's probably why this sequel idea has more narrative potential than people expected. You can already see online discourse splitting into camps. One group wants pure nostalgia. They want familiar romance, familiar music cues, familiar emotional comfort. Another group wants something darker and more mature. The fascinating thing about the trailer is that it appears to be trying both simultaneously. That's dangerous creatively, but when it works, it can elevate a franchise beyond its original limitations. Take the color grading alone. People online immediately noticed the return of cooler blue-gray tones resembling Twilight rather than the warmer cinematic look of the later sequels. That isn't accidental. The first film had this almost indie drama atmosphere because director Catherine Hardwicke approached the material like emotionally heightened young adult melancholy instead of polished blockbuster fantasy. Fans subconsciously associate that visual texture with authenticity. This trailer taps into that exact emotional language. Even the soundtrack choice feels calculated in a smart way. Instead of using some giant orchestral remix screaming, "Epic franchise return," they went with this haunting, low-tempo indie track layered beneath ambient forest sounds. It feels intimate, slightly sad, which is exactly what Twilight should feel like. And honestly, if the movie commits fully to that atmosphere, instead of eventually collapsing into CGI chaos, it could surprise people critically too. Not universally, obviously. Twilight will always carry cultural baggage. Some critics already decided years ago what these films represent, and they're not going to suddenly reevaluate the franchise because one sequel trailer looks promising. But culture shifts over time. Younger critics today are often more willing to examine why emotionally sincere stories resonate with audiences instead of instantly dismissing them as unserious. You can already feel that reevaluation happening online. People who once mocked Twilight publicly are now admitting the soundtrack was incredible. The mood was unique. The romance felt emotionally committed in a way many sanitized streaming-era productions don't anymore. There's something refreshing about stories willing to be emotionally overwhelming without constantly undercutting themselves. And look, I'm not pretending the original series suddenly transformed into misunderstood art house filmmaking. Some performances were uneven. Some dialogue choices remain unintentionally funny. Certain visual effects aged badly. But sincerity has value. Genuine emotional commitment leaves a mark even when execution gets messy. The trailer understands that legacy surprisingly well. Another detail I appreciated. Jacob doesn't feel reduced to nostalgia bait here. Taylor Lautner looks older in a way that actually benefits the character. There's more weight in his expressions now, less impulsive teenage energy, more exhaustion, more restraint. And considering Jacob's entire existence became emotionally complicated after imprinting on Renesmee, there's fertile dramatic territory there, if handled carefully. Because honestly, that storyline always made audiences uncomfortable. Even hardcore fans admitted it felt strange. But time passing allows the franchise to approach it differently now. Renesmee becoming an adult means the emotional dynamic changes entirely. The trailer seems aware of lingering discomfort too, because Jacob's scenes carry visible emotional conflict rather than simplistic devotion. He looks like somebody questioning his own place in a world that kept evolving around him. That's infinitely more interesting than repeating old love triangle drama. And speaking of evolution, the most intriguing rumor surrounding this project involves its antagonist. Nothing officially confirmed yet, obviously, but industry chatter suggests the new threat may not come from traditional vampire factions at all. There's speculation about immortal hybrids emerging elsewhere globally, which actually makes sense logically. If Renesmee exists, why wouldn't similar anomalies appear eventually? That concept expands the mythology without completely breaking it. Hollywood franchises often fail because sequels confuse escalation with emotional depth. Bigger armies, bigger destruction, bigger stakes, but audiences rarely remember scale emotionally. They remember tension, relationships, fear, longing. The trailer wisely keeps the conflict personal instead of apocalyptic. Even visually, the action glimpses feel grounded. One shot shows Edward and Bella inside what looks like an abandoned coastal town during heavy rain. Another features Alice, having what appears to be fragmented visions again, but they're edited almost like horror imagery this time. Brief flashes, distorted sound, human silhouettes disappearing from snowy landscapes. There's actual unease there, and Ashley Greene slipping back into Alice's energy so naturally is honestly impressive. Some actors return to iconic roles, and you can practically see them remembering mannerisms mechanically. Greene feels instinctive here. Alice still carries that fragile brightness mixed with underlying sadness. Which brings me to probably the most important thing this trailer gets right. Nobody seems frozen emotionally. That would have been the easiest mistake imaginable with immortal characters. Just replaying old personality traits forever. But the footage suggests time affected everyone psychologically, even if their appearances remained largely unchanged. Bella seems more introspective. Edward looks emotionally tired in subtle ways. Carlisle appears increasingly burdened by immortality itself. Even Rosalie's brief scene carries this strange, protective warmth that contrasts sharply with her colder, earlier characterization. That's believable growth. Immortality only becomes dramatically interesting if characters evolve emotionally while remaining physically static. Otherwise, they become mannequins, repeating themselves endlessly. And maybe that's why the trailer unexpectedly connected with older audiences too. Because beneath all the supernatural mythology, the emotional core appears to be about time, about watching generations shift while trying desperately to preserve connection, about realizing forever isn't romantic unless you can emotionally survive what forever actually means. There's a shot near the end that captures this perfectly. Bella stands outside the Cullen house at dawn, while snow falls lightly around her. She's staring toward the tree line, listening to something unseen. The camera stays behind her long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable. Then Edward steps beside her and quietly asks, "Do you ever miss being afraid?" That line hit me harder than I expected, because fear gave the original Saga urgency. Bella's humanity created stakes emotionally. Mortality made love feel temporary and therefore meaningful. Once immortality entered the equation fully, the story risked losing tension. But this sequel seems interested in psychological fear instead. Fear of losing identity, fear of watching loved ones drift emotionally, fear of becoming disconnected from humanity itself. That's mature territory. Not necessarily darker for the sake of darkness, just older. And honestly, the industry context surrounding this project makes the whole thing even more fascinating. Hollywood right now is desperate for theatrical franchises that attract female audiences consistently. Superhero fatigue changed studio priorities dramatically. Executives realized they spent years chasing four-quadrant spectacle while neglecting emotionally driven franchise storytelling aimed specifically at women. Twilight returning now suddenly makes strategic sense, especially because younger audiences discovering the original films through streaming platforms created an entirely new fandom cycle. That happens constantly now. Movies never really disappear anymore. They get rediscovered algorithmically. A 14-year-old today can binge the entire Twilight Saga in one weekend and experience it emotionally almost the same way original fans did in theaters. Studios notice those streaming numbers obsessively. And unlike many dormant franchises, Twilight still has recognizable visual identity. Forests, rain, pale skin, piano music, intense eye contact. You instantly know the world aesthetically. Branding matters enormously now because audiences are overwhelmed with content constantly competing for attention. But branding alone doesn't create emotional investment. The reason this trailer exploded online is because it feels like it remembers the emotional loneliness that made Twilight resonate in the first place. Not the memes, not the cultural discourse, the feeling. That aching feeling of wanting time to stop while knowing it never really can. And maybe that's the strangest thing about revisiting a franchise like Twilight in 2026. The audience changed more than the characters did. Back when these movies dominated pop culture, people experienced them in the middle of adolescence. Everything felt immediate then. Love felt permanent. Heartbreak felt fatal. Identity itself felt unstable from one month to the next. Twilight plugged directly into that emotional intensity, which is why so many viewers connected to it on this almost embarrassingly personal level. Now those same viewers are older, and suddenly the story reads differently. You notice the loneliness more. You notice the sacrifices more. You notice how immortality in this universe often resembles emotional stagnation instead of wish fulfillment. And honestly, that might be exactly why a continuation works now when it probably wouldn't have worked before. Because the trailer isn't selling fantasy the same way the originals did. It's selling reflection. That becomes obvious during the quieter dialogue moments scattered throughout the footage. There's far less focus on destiny or eternal romance this time. The emotional language feels more grounded, more cautious. Bella and Edward aren't framed like unattainable fantasy figures anymore. They feel like people who have spent years protecting something fragile, while realizing protection itself comes with consequences. One scene especially stands out. Renesmee sits across from Bella inside what looks like a dimly lit diner somewhere outside Forks. Rain hitting the windows. Barely any music underneath the conversation. And Renesmee asks her, "Did you ever regret choosing this life?" Bella doesn't answer immediately. That pause matters because older Twilight movies often rushed emotional revelations. Here, silence communicates conflict better than dialogue could. Bella finally says, "Regret isn't the right word, but forever changes shape after a while." That's not teenage romance anymore. That's adulthood speaking. And if the actual film maintains that emotional maturity consistently, it could become something genuinely interesting rather than just commercially inevitable. Another thing I noticed while rewatching the trailer several times, because honestly, there's more visual detail packed into it than people first realized, is how carefully the film appears to be balancing nostalgia with distance. The familiar locations return, but they don't feel frozen in amber. Forks looks older, quieter, slightly emptier. Even the Cullen house has subtle design changes that suggest time passed there emotionally, not just chronologically. That's smart production design. Legacy sequels often make the mistake of preserving everything too perfectly because studios fear upsetting fan attachment. But real time leaves marks on places. Houses evolve, towns change, forests feel different depending on memory. This trailer understands environmental nostalgia instead of simply recreating old imagery shot for shot. And visually, the cinematography has this softer texture, that almost resembles winter daylight filtered through fogged glass. It's beautiful, without looking overly polished. A lot of modern streaming productions suffer from that aggressively clean digital look, where every frame appears artificially sharpened. Twilight always benefited from visual softness because the story itself exists somewhere between reality and dream logic. The trailer preserves that atmosphere surprisingly well. Then there's the question everybody keeps debating online. Does the franchise still work culturally today? Honestly, yes, but differently. The original Twilight era existed during a very specific moment in internet culture. Social media was growing rapidly, fandom culture was exploding publicly, and people still consumed blockbuster franchises collectively instead of through fragmented algorithm bubbles. Twilight became an event because everyone argued about it simultaneously. Team Edward versus Team Jacob wasn't just marketing. It became a genuine cultural phenomenon. You probably couldn't recreate that exact environment now. But modern audiences connect through emotional nostalgia instead. Shared memory replaced monoculture. That changes how a sequel gets received. People aren't returning simply to continue a story. They're returning to reconnect with a feeling associated with a certain period of their lives. Hollywood executives understand this better than they admit publicly. That's why so many dormant franchises suddenly reappear once the original audience reaches adulthood. Nostalgia spending becomes incredibly powerful around people's late 20s and 30s because memory itself gains emotional value. But nostalgia alone doesn't sustain a 2-hour movie. The trailer knows it needs actual dramatic tension too, and that's where the mysterious new mythology elements become important. There are several blink-and-you-miss-it shots hinting at something fundamentally changing within the vampire world itself. One image shows ancient carvings inside what appears to be a hidden European structure. Another reveals vampire eyes turning completely silver during moments of emotional instability. Fans online immediately started theorizing about evolutionary changes within immortals themselves. And honestly, that idea makes thematic sense. The Twilight universe always centered around control. Vampires suppressing instinct. Werewolves controlling rage. Bella controlling transformation. If this sequel explores immortality becoming psychologically unstable over time, that introduces fascinating stakes without relying on giant end-of-the-world spectacle. Imagine living forever while slowly losing emotional coherence. That's terrifying, especially for characters who spent decades believing they mastered themselves completely. There's also a fascinating generational undercurrent throughout the trailer that I didn't expect at all. Renesmee clearly isn't portrayed as simply the child character grown up. She represents a bridge between worlds that older generations don't fully understand. Human enough to question vampire isolation. Immortal enough to view humanity differently. That creates ideological tension naturally. And honestly, younger audiences may connect with her perspective more than Bella's this time around. That's probably intentional. Franchises survive by transferring emotional identification gradually from one generation of characters to another. The smartest thing this sequel appears to be doing is allowing Bella and Edward to age emotionally into mentor-like figures without stripping them of importance, which is difficult. A lot of legacy sequels either sideline original protagonists too aggressively or cling to them so tightly new characters never breathe. The trailer suggests a more balanced transition. And speaking of balance, one thing I absolutely appreciate is the restraint regarding action footage. Seriously, modern trailers practically summarize entire third acts now because studios panic audiences will lose attention otherwise. This preview withholds almost everything substantial. We see glimpses of pursuit sequences through snowy forests, fragmented confrontations, flashes of violence, but no clear explanation of the larger conflict. That confidence feels refreshing, especially because mystery used to be such an important part of blockbuster marketing before every studio became obsessed with spoiler-heavy promotion campaigns. There's a brief shot near the midpoint that perfectly demonstrates this restraint. Alice suddenly turns during what looks like a family gathering and whispers, "They found her." That's it. No explanation, no immediate reveal, just instant tension across every face in the room. The editing cuts away before audiences understand what "her" even means. And that tiny moment probably generated more online discussion than any oversized CGI battle could have, because suspense lives inside unanswered questions. Something else worth talking about is how differently audiences may interpret Bella now compared to the late 2000s. Back then, critics constantly framed her as passive or emotionally dependent, and while some of those critiques had validity, they also simplified the character enormously. Watching the trailer now, Bella feels transformed by experience rather than romance alone. Kristen Stewart's screen presence changed dramatically over the years too. She carries herself differently as an actor now. More confidence, more emotional precision, less concern about audience approval. That evolution benefits Bella enormously because the character no longer reads like somebody searching for identity. She reads like somebody protecting one she fought hard to build. And honestly, Stewart returning here after spending years making smaller, riskier films gives the project credibility it otherwise might lack. You can feel that seriousness throughout the footage. Nobody appears to be treating this like parody material or ironic nostalgia bait. The performances look emotionally committed, grounded, slightly mournful even, which fits Twilight perfectly. Because beneath all the supernatural romance, these stories were always kind of sad. That sadness is what separated Twilight from a lot of competing YA franchises during its peak. The world felt emotionally cold. Beautiful? Yes, but cold. Love existed alongside isolation constantly. Even happy moments carried underlying melancholy, because immortality itself created distance from ordinary life. The trailer leans hard into that emotional texture again. There's a gorgeous shot late in the preview where Bella and Renee stand overlooking a fog-covered valley at sunrise. No dialogue, just wind moving through trees. Renee looks outward while Bella watches her instead of the landscape. That visual framing tells you everything. Bella already understands what eternity costs. Renee is only beginning to realize it. And honestly, if the movie truly explores that emotional inheritance thoughtfully instead of collapsing into franchise formula halfway through, it might end up resonating with audiences far more deeply than people expect right now. Because sometimes stories people dismissed as teenage fantasy years ago age into something unexpectedly reflective once the audience grows older alongside them. The more I sat with the trailer afterward, the more I started thinking about how unusual the Twilight franchise really was compared to everything that came after it. people lump it together with the YA adaptation boom of the 2010s, but emotionally it never functioned the same way as The Hunger Games or Divergent, or even the later dystopian imitator studios desperately tried manufacturing. Those stories centered around systems, revolutions, survival structures. Twilight was never about society. It was about obsession, desire, emotional dependency, fear of loss, fear of time. That intimacy is probably why it survived culturally, while so many copycat franchises disappeared completely. And this new trailer seems to understand that making the story bigger is not the same thing as making it more meaningful. One thing that genuinely surprised me was how restrained the visual effects appear. Not absent, obviously. These are still supernatural characters moving through heightened reality. But the trailer avoids that glossy artificiality infecting a lot of modern fantasy filmmaking. Even the vampire speed effects look more tactile now, less like digital blur pasted onto footage and more physically integrated into the environment. That matters more than audiences consciously realize. When visual effects become too weightless, emotional stakes disappear alongside them. Twilight always worked best when supernatural elements felt strangely grounded inside ordinary spaces. Forests, parking lots, bedrooms, small town roads at night. The contrast between mundane environments and impossible emotions created the franchise's identity. The trailer returns to that visual philosophy constantly. There's a scene where Bella and Edward appear to be investigating disappearances near a coastal town in Oregon, and the atmosphere almost resembles a supernatural crime drama for a moment. Empty streets, flickering neon lights reflecting off rainwater, human fear lingering beneath quiet conversations. It feels mature without trying too hard to appear adult. That's a difficult balance. A lot of legacy sequels become obsessed with proving they've matured, which usually translates into excessive darkness or cynicism. This trailer doesn't feel cynical at all. Melancholic, yes. Reflective, definitely. But not embarrassed by emotional sincerity. And honestly, sincerity is becoming weirdly rare in blockbuster filmmaking. Everything now feels filtered through irony or self-awareness because studios are terrified audiences will mock emotional vulnerability online. Twilight never had that protective shield. These characters loved desperately. They suffered openly. They spoke like emotions physically hurt them sometimes. And people laughed at that for years. But somewhere along the way, audiences started missing stories, willing to risk emotional intensity without constantly apologizing for it. That cultural shift is a huge reason this sequel suddenly feels viable now. There's also something fascinating about the timing from an industry perspective. Hollywood spent the last decade chasing interconnected cinematic universes so aggressively that many franchises lost their individual identity completely. Twilight existed before that formula consumed everything. It wasn't trying to set up 12 spin-offs and multiverse crossovers. It simply wanted viewers emotionally invested in a specific relationship dynamic. This trailer keeps things personal again. Even the conflict appears emotionally motivated rather than structurally engineered. You don't get the sense some cosmic threat is arriving to destroy Earth. Instead, it feels like secrets buried over decades are finally resurfacing in ways the Cullen family cannot fully control anymore. That's much more compelling. One detail fans caught immediately online involves the Volturi imagery hidden throughout the trailer. They barely appear directly, but their presence lingers everywhere. Red ceremonial cloaks reflected briefly in mirrors, ancient symbols resembling Volturi architecture. Arrow's voice seemingly layered backward beneath one sound transition. That's clever franchise storytelling, because it reminds audiences of unresolved power structures without immediately dragging old villains front and center again. And honestly, the Volturi always represented the most interesting part of Twilight mythology conceptually. They weren't just antagonists, they were institutional immortality, control disguised as order, ancient beings preserving secrecy through fear. The original films touched on that idea without fully exploring it. This sequel might finally go deeper there, especially because immortality itself seems framed differently now. In the earlier movies, eternal life carried romantic allure, despite occasional warnings. Here, immortality feels heavier, more psychologically exhausting. Carlisle's brief moments in the trailer communicate that especially well. Peter Fasinelli always understood something important about Carlisle that often went unnoticed. He wasn't simply a wise father figure. He was somebody carrying centuries of accumulated grief while trying desperately to remain compassionate. The trailer leans into that exhaustion subtly. His eyes look tired in a profoundly human way, despite the character technically remaining ageless. There's a moment where he tells Bella, "Time doesn't heal us. It just teaches us how to carry things." That line feels like the emotional thesis of the entire movie, because this story no longer appears interested in fantasy fulfillment alone. It's about emotional endurance. And honestly, that's why older audiences are probably responding so strongly to the trailer online. People who grew up with Twilight now understand carrying emotional weight in ways teenagers simply can't yet. Regret, change, complicated family bonds. Watching younger generations make choices you already know will hurt them eventually. Renesmee's role becomes crucial there. The trailer smartly avoids turning her into some generic rebellious teenager archetype. Instead, she seems intellectually restless, curious about humanity in ways Bella once was curious about immortality. That inversion creates beautiful symmetry. Bella spent the original Saga longing to escape ordinary human life. Renesmee appears fascinated by the fragility and emotional immediacy humans experience naturally. There's one incredibly brief shot where she's sitting alone inside a crowded high school gym during what looks like a winter dance. Everybody around her moves normally, while she remains almost emotionally detached from the moment. Not cold exactly, just observant, separate. That isolation hits differently now, especially because the franchise's original audience probably recognizes adult loneliness far more intimately than teenage loneliness at this stage of life. And then there's the trailer's final minute, which honestly elevates the entire thing beyond simple nostalgia marketing. The editing slows down dramatically. Music nearly disappears. You get fragmented emotional images instead of narrative information. Bella touching an old photograph. Jacob standing beside his motorcycle at night staring into the woods. Alice crying silently while watching visions nobody else can see. Edward running through snow carrying someone whose face remains hidden from the audience. Every image feels emotionally loaded without full context. That's confidence. And it culminates in probably the trailer's most haunting line. Renesmee asks Bella, "What happens when forever stops feeling infinite?" The screen cuts to black immediately afterward. No explosion, no jump scare, no dramatic villain reveal, just silence. And honestly, That line alone explains why this sequel concept suddenly works emotionally. Because the audience grew old enough to understand the question. Teenagers fantasize about forever. Adults understand forever can become frightening. The trailer seems built entirely around that emotional evolution, not rejecting the romantic core of Twilight, but reframing it through maturity and time. That's far more interesting than simply repeating the original formula. Now, whether the actual film can sustain this atmosphere for a full runtime is another question entirely. Trailers are emotional manipulation machines by design. Great trailers sometimes advertise mediocre movies. We've all experienced that disappointment countless times. But even acknowledging that reality, there's undeniable care visible here. You can feel filmmakers trying to reconnect with the emotional identity of Twilight rather than just exploiting brand recognition mechanically. And audiences notice authenticity instinctively. That's probably why reaction videos exploded almost immediately after the trailer released. Not because viewers expected groundbreaking cinema necessarily, but because they sensed emotional sincerity returning in a genre landscape increasingly dominated by detached corporate storytelling. People miss emotional risk. They miss stories unafraid of yearning. And Twilight, for all its flaws, awkward moments, and endlessly debated creative choices, always understood yearning better than most franchises ever did. This trailer remembers that. It remembers cold weather romance, quiet loneliness, the ache of wanting permanence in a world built around change, the strange sadness hidden inside immortal fantasy. The feeling of watching people you love drift emotionally beyond your reach, even while they stand beside you physically. And maybe that's why the footage lingers in your head long after it ends. Not because it promises spectacle, because it promises feeling. What I also find really interesting is how carefully the trailer avoids trying to recreate the exact emotional energy of 2008. That would have been the easiest nostalgia trap imaginable. Just throw Bella and Edward back into endless longing stares, replay iconic musical motifs, flood the screen with references, and hope audiences emotionally autocomplete the experience themselves. But this feels more reflective than romantic in a traditional sense. Even the chemistry between Bella and Edward has evolved into something quieter. And honestly, that's believable. People change after years together, especially people carrying the psychological weight these characters carry. The trailer doesn't portray them like frozen teenagers trapped inside eternal infatuation anymore. There's comfort between them now. History, shared exhaustion, a kind of emotional shorthand that only exists after surviving decades together. That maturity actually makes their relationship more compelling to me than it was in some of the earlier films. Because real long-term love rarely looks cinematic in obvious ways. It becomes smaller, more protective, more intuitive. You see that throughout the footage constantly. Edward watching Bella instead of speaking. Bella recognizing his concern before he verbalizes it. Tiny gestures replacing dramatic declarations. There's a scene where they sit together in complete silence while snow falls outside the Cullen house windows, and somehow it communicates more intimacy than half the dialogue-heavy romance scenes from the original Saga. That restraint is smart, especially because audiences today are emotionally exhausted by performative blockbuster romance. Most modern franchise relationships feel written by committee. Characters flirt through quips instead of vulnerability. Emotional sincerity gets buried beneath sarcasm because studios think genuine tenderness risks looking uncool. Twilight never cared about looking cool, and this sequel seems equally uninterested in chasing modern franchise trends. That's probably why the trailer stands out so strongly right now. Even structurally, it feels different from contemporary blockbuster marketing. There's no giant explanatory voiceover outlining the plot mechanics, no one last mission cliché, no desperate attempt to convince audiences the fate of the entire universe hangs in the balance. The stakes appear emotional first, supernatural second, which is exactly how Twilight should function. One thing I noticed after multiple rewatches is how frequently mirrors and reflections appear throughout the footage. That's not accidental visual language. Bella sees Renesmee reflected in windows repeatedly. Edward appears fragmented in broken glass during one sequence. Alice touches a mirror during a vision scene as if trying to reach through memory itself. The imagery suggests identity fragmentation. And honestly, that's fascinating territory for this franchise because identity always sat at the center of Twilight, even when the films expressed it awkwardly sometimes. Bella wanted transformation because she felt emotionally incomplete as a human. Edward feared losing moral identity through immortality. Jacob struggled between human life and supernatural obligation. Now Renesmee inherits all those tensions simultaneously. That gives the sequel thematic depth if handled properly. And I'll say this too, the aging of the original audience may actually protect the movie from the kind of vicious cultural backlash Twilight faced initially. Back then, internet criticism often became performative. Mocking Twilight publicly turned into a personality trait for certain corners of online culture. But the media landscape changed dramatically since then. Audiences became more willing to acknowledge emotional storytelling aimed at women without instantly dismissing it as unserious. You even see film critics reassessing the original Saga now, with more nuance. Not necessarily calling every movie great, obviously, but recognizing the franchise had a unique atmosphere and emotional specificity many imitators lacked completely. This trailer benefits enormously from that reevaluation, because instead of arriving as some embarrassing relic from the late 2000s, Twilight now feels almost strangely distinctive again. In an era dominated by hyper-polished digital spectacle, its emotional awkwardness and moody sincerity suddenly stand out positively. And honestly, the Pacific Northwest setting deserves enormous credit for that identity too. Few franchises use environment as emotionally as Twilight does. Forks isn't just backdrop. The weather itself becomes emotional texture. Rain, fog, cold light filtering through trees. The environment constantly reinforces loneliness and longing visually. This trailer leans heavily into that atmosphere again, and thank God for that, because removing Twilight from that climate would destroy half its emotional DNA instantly. There's a gorgeous aerial shot midway through the trailer where clouds drift over endless forests while distant piano notes echo underneath. No dialogue, no plot exposition, just mood. That confidence and atmosphere is becoming increasingly rare. Studios usually panic unless every second delivers immediate narrative information. But audiences remember feeling more than exposition. The Twilight films understood that intuitively, even when other aspects stumbled. Another fascinating element here is the possibility that the sequel may finally examine immortality from a female perspective beyond romantic fantasy. The original Saga mostly framed Bella's transformation as liberation. She becomes stronger, faster, eternally connected to the person she loves. But this trailer hints at more complicated emotional consequences now, especially regarding motherhood. That diner scene between Bella and Renesmee doesn't feel accidental at all. Bella isn't simply guiding her daughter. She seems afraid of what she passed down to her. Not physically necessarily, but existentially. Immortality itself becomes inherited burden. That's powerful thematic material. There's one tiny moment almost hidden in the trailer where Bella watches human teenagers laughing outside a convenience store late at night. The camera stays on her expression just long enough for you to realize she misses something about ordinary impermanence. That emotion completely reframes the original Saga. Back then, Bella viewed human life as fragile limitation. Now she seems aware fragility also gives life urgency and meaning. Immortality solves certain fears, while creating entirely new forms of loneliness. And honestly, that evolution makes the character far more interesting than she was originally. Kristen Stewart's performance style now fits Bella better too. Back during the original films, audiences sometimes misread Stewart's restraint as emotional emptiness, when really, she's an incredibly internal actor. Over time, viewers learned how expressive she actually is through subtle physical behavior, tiny eye movements, hesitation in speech, emotional suppression barely cracking open. The trailer uses that beautifully. Bella feels constantly thoughtful here, like somebody carrying years of memory simultaneously. Stewart no longer plays her like an overwhelmed teenager. She plays her like someone aware every decision echoes forever now. That emotional intelligence changes the tone of the entire franchise. And then there's the question of whether younger audiences with no nostalgia attachment will connect to this continuation at all. Honestly, I think they might. Not necessarily because they experienced the original phenomenon firsthand, but because the emotional themes remain universal. Loneliness, identity, desire for connection, fear of becoming disconnected from ordinary life. Those anxieties don't disappear generationally. If anything, younger audiences today may connect even more strongly to stories about emotional isolation. Modern digital culture created endless connection while simultaneously intensifying loneliness for many people. Twilight always operated inside emotional isolation already. Characters constantly felt psychologically separated from the world around them. That emotional framework still resonates, especially when presented with maturity rather than teenage melodrama alone. Another thing the trailer smartly avoids is over-explaining mythology updates. That restraint matters, because one reason some later Twilight films lost momentum emotionally was excessive lore exposition. Ancient vampire politics, treaty details, supernatural classifications. Whenever the series became too focused on explaining its universe mechanically, the emotional core weakened. This trailer keeps mythology mysterious again. You sense history beneath the surface without getting overwhelmed by rules and exposition. That's the correct choice. Twilight's world works best when it feels emotionally intuitive rather than scientifically structured. And visually, the movie seems committed to practical environments again instead of endless green screen abstraction. Forests feel cold. Houses feel lived in. Small towns feel geographically real. Actors physically occupy spaces instead of floating through digital emptiness. That tactile quality helps enormously with immersion. There's a brief nighttime sequence involving Jacob running through snowy woods that looks almost entirely practical, and the physical texture of the environment makes the moment feel genuinely tense. Snow crunching under movement, breath visible in freezing air, darkness swallowing parts of the frame naturally instead of through artificial lighting. You can tell the filmmakers want this world to feel inhabited again, and maybe that's ultimately why the trailer affected people more than expected. It doesn't feel manufactured in the same cynical way many franchise revivals do. Obviously, the studio wants commercial success. That's unavoidable. But underneath the business reality, there appears to be genuine emotional curiosity driving the project too. Curiosity about what happens after fantasy fulfillment, after eternal love becomes ordinary existence, after immortality loses novelty, after generations shift, after memory itself becomes heavier than desire. That's compelling territory for any story, honestly. And if Twilight 6 truly commits to exploring those ideas, instead of abandoning them for generic blockbuster formula halfway through, it could end up becoming something much more emotionally resonant than anyone expected when those first sequel rumors started circulating online years ago. You know what's funny? The more people discuss this trailer online, the more you realize Twilight never actually disappeared. It just stopped being fashionable to openly admit people cared about it. There's a difference. Franchises truly die when emotional attachment disappears completely. Twilight's attachment never disappeared. It went underground for a while. Then streaming platforms brought the movies back into circulation. Younger audiences discovered them without the baggage of late 2000s internet mockery, and suddenly people started reevaluating what those films actually made them feel. And feelings matter more than reputation in the long run. That's something Hollywood still struggles to understand sometimes. Critics can debate structure, performances, dialogue, visual effects, all valid conversations, but audiences remember emotional experiences first. They remember how a movie felt during specific moments in their lives. Twilight embedded itself deeply into people's emotional memory because it understood intensity, not realism necessarily. Intensity. Everything in those films felt emotionally heightened. Rain looked sadder. Silence felt heavier. Music hit harder. Love seemed catastrophic. Loneliness felt endless. Twilight existed inside emotional extremes teenagers recognize instinctively, and adults later remember with this strange mix of embarrassment and nostalgia. But this sequel trailer does something smarter than simply recreating teenage intensity. It asks what happens after intensity fades into permanence. That's such a grown-up question for this franchise to explore. And honestly, the trailer becomes more impressive the more you think about how carefully it reframes the mythology around emotional consequence instead of fantasy wish fulfillment. Bella, achieving immortality, originally played like romantic destiny fulfilled. Now immortality feels almost existential. The passage of time no longer threatens death. It threatens emotional erosion. That's darker in a mature way. Not horror movie dark. Human dark. There's one tiny visual detail I haven't seen enough people mention yet. During a brief montage sequence, Bella opens a drawer filled with old photographs from her human life. Charlie, Renee, high school memories, people long gone now. The camera lingers for maybe 3 seconds, but it tells you everything about where this story is emotionally. Immortality means becoming the archive. You keep living while entire eras disappear around you. That idea alone gives the sequel emotional weight beyond nostalgia marketing. And it also explains why the trailer feels unexpectedly melancholic instead of triumphant. Most franchise returns arrive screaming about legacy and spectacle and one last ride. This feels quieter, sadder, more reflective. Almost like the characters themselves understand time, change the meaning of their existence. Even Edward feels different in subtle but important ways. Robert Pattinson's performance here, at least from what little we see, appears far less theatrical than before. Younger Edward carried constant romantic intensity because he existed as Bella's impossible fantasy figure. Older Edward feels more human emotionally, despite technically remaining immortal. He looks tired sometimes, concerned, protective in quieter ways. There's a shot where he's standing alone in the woods during snowfall, listening to distant sounds we cannot hear. And for a second, he genuinely resembles someone burdened by endless memory instead of seductively mysterious. That evolution works beautifully, because the fantasy of immortality changes completely once you emotionally mature. Teenagers imagine endless time as freedom. Adults understand endless time also means endless grief, endless adaptation, endless witnessing. The trailer taps into that understanding constantly. And honestly, that's probably why older fans are reacting so emotionally to it online. They're not reconnecting with who they were during Twilight's original release. They're reconnecting with how much they've changed since then. That emotional mirror effect is powerful. There's also a really smart restraint regarding fan service throughout the footage. Yes, Recognizable imagery returns: forests, piano music, Cullen family gatherings, but nothing feels lazily recycled. The trailer uses familiarity emotionally instead of mechanically. That distinction matters enormously. A bad legacy sequel simply repeats old moments louder. A good one understands why those moments mattered emotionally and evolves them naturally. This trailer appears much closer to the second category. Even Jacob's role seems more emotionally layered than expected. Taylor Lautner looks genuinely comfortable inhabiting the character again, which honestly surprised me a little because there was a period where the entire Team Edward versus Team Jacob phenomenon almost overshadowed the actual performances themselves. But here, Jacob carries visible emotional complexity, especially in scenes involving Renesmee. And thank God the trailer avoids romanticizing their dynamic in simplistic ways. Instead, it frames Jacob like somebody struggling with destiny itself, bound emotionally to a future he never fully chose. Protective, yes, but conflicted too. That complexity was necessary, because audiences are older now. The franchise cannot approach certain themes with the same emotional simplicity it did originally. The trailer seems aware of that maturity gap constantly. One thing I genuinely admire is how little dialogue the preview actually uses overall. Modern trailers over-explain everything because studios fear ambiguity. Here, long stretches rely purely on atmosphere and expression. Characters look at each other more than they speak. Sound design carries emotion. Weather carries emotion. That confidence feels refreshing. There's a breathtaking sequence near the end involving Alice having fragmented visions while sitting alone in a dark room lit only by television static and distant lightning flashes. Quick flashes of snow-covered mountains, a burning house, Renesmee screaming underwater, Edward collapsing to his knees somewhere in the forest. None of it fully explained, all emotionally disturbing. And Ashley Greene absolutely sells the terror in Alice's face there. Not theatrical panic, real dread, like somebody seeing possibilities too terrible to articulate completely. That scene alone suggests the film may lean harder into psychological tension than previous Twilight installments did, which honestly fits the franchise better than oversized action ever did. The original films were always strongest during moments of emotional unease rather than combat spectacle. Suspense, longing, anticipation, fear of losing control. Those were the emotions Twilight handled best. The trailer returns to those emotional roots constantly. And can we talk for a second about how good the sound design appears to be here? Seriously, tiny environmental details matter enormously in atmospheric storytelling. Rain against windows, wind moving through trees, footsteps echoing through empty hallways, breathing during tense silence. The trailer mixes environmental sound almost like a psychological thriller sometimes. That sensory realism grounds the fantasy beautifully. Because Twilight's world only works when supernatural elements feel embedded inside physical reality rather than floating above it artificially. Another fascinating layer here involves generational perspective. Bella once desired immortality desperately because she feared ordinary human limitation. Renesmee appears almost inversely fascinated by ordinary humanity because she grew up separated from it emotionally. That reversal creates natural thematic depth. There's a brief classroom scene where Renesmee watches human students argue and laugh and flirt awkwardly, and her expression isn't superiority. It's curiosity, maybe even envy. She wants immediacy. Humans feel things urgently because time limits them. Immortals lose urgency eventually. That's the emotional territory this sequel appears obsessed with exploring. And honestly, That's a surprisingly sophisticated thematic direction for a franchise many people once dismissed as shallow teenage fantasy, which just proves something film history repeatedly demonstrates. Stories aimed at young audiences often contain deeper emotional truths than critics initially recognize. Time changes perspective. Distance reveals thematic layers people overlooked, while cultural discourse focused on surface-level mockery. Twilight always understood emotional hunger. That was its secret strength. Not perfect dialogue, not flawless filmmaking. Emotional hunger. The desire to hold on to love permanently. The terror of abandonment. The fantasy of escaping ordinary mortality. The fear of being emotionally invisible. Those feelings made the franchise resonate globally despite all its imperfections. And this trailer seems determined to ask what happens after those desires are fulfilled. That's fascinating territory because fulfillment rarely ends stories emotionally. It transforms them. You can feel that transformation in every frame here. Bella no longer longs for eternity. She lives inside it. Edward no longer fears losing Bella. He fears what endless existence may slowly do to the people he loves. Jacob no longer fights for romantic connection. He questions purpose itself. Renesmee stands at the center of all those inherited emotional conflicts simultaneously. And somewhere beneath the supernatural mythology, the trailer quietly becomes about parents realizing they cannot fully protect their children from the emotional consequences of choices made long before those children even existed. That's deeply human, which is probably why the footage resonates beyond simple franchise nostalgia. Underneath the vampires and werewolves and immortal mythology, Twilight 6. The new chapter appears interested in something emotionally universal. What happens when the future you once dreamed about finally arrives and keeps going long enough to change meaning completely? If there's one thing that really ties everything in this trailer together, it's a sense that nobody in this world is actually living outside time, the way immortality is usually sold in fiction. They're just experiencing time differently. And that difference slowly reshapes everything they thought they understood about love, identity, and belonging. That's the quiet shift happening underneath every scene. And it changes how you read even the simplest moments. Take Bella, for example. In the early films, she was defined by urgency. Every choice felt immediate, almost breathless. She was reacting to a world she barely understood, constantly pulled forward by emotion. In this trailer, she feels like someone who has already made the irreversible decision and is now learning what it actually costs to sustain it. That's a completely different psychological state. There's a shot that captures it perfectly. Bella standing in the Cullen house early in the morning, light filtering through large windows, everything silent except distant wind outside. She isn't doing anything, just observing the space she's lived in for years now. And there's this subtle expression on her face that doesn't read like happiness or sadness, but awareness. Like she's fully conscious of how permanent her existence has become. That kind of emotional framing is rare in franchise filmmaking, because most sequels are built around motion, movement, plot escalation. Something always has to be happening. But this trailer allows stillness to carry meaning instead of treating it like dead air. And that stillness is where the emotional weight really sits. It's also where Renesmee becomes even more important conceptually, because she introduces something the original Saga never had to fully deal with. A character who didn't choose immortality, didn't romanticize it, and didn't grow into it gradually from human experience. She simply exists inside it from the beginning of her awareness. That creates a completely different relationship with time. There's a moment in the trailer where she looks at Bella and says something along the lines of, not understanding why humans rush through everything. It's not delivered as judgment, more like curiosity. But Bella's reaction is what matters more than the line itself. You can see her struggling to explain something she once felt instinctively, but can no longer fully access the same way. That gap between experience and explanation becomes emotional tension on its own. And honestly, that's where the writing for this sequel seems strongest so far. Not in mythology expansion, but in emotional translation. How do you explain human impermanence to someone who will never experience it the same way? How do you explain eternal existence to someone who still thinks in beginnings and endings? Those aren't fantasy questions. They're philosophical ones. Even Edward's presence in the trailer starts to feel less like the central romantic axis and more like a stabilizing force trying to hold together emotional systems that are slowly evolving beyond their original design. There's a softness to him now that wasn't always emphasized in earlier films. Not weakness, but awareness. You get the sense he has spent decades watching emotional patterns repeat in slightly different forms. And that repetition itself has changed him. One of the most subtle but powerful ideas in the trailer is that immortality doesn't stop emotional change. It just stretches it. Feelings don't disappear. They accumulate. They layer. They echo. A single memory doesn't fade. It becomes part of a larger internal landscape that keeps expanding. That's why the Cullen family scenes feel so emotionally dense, even when nothing overtly dramatic is happening. There's history in every glance. And the trailer never over-explains that history, which is what makes it work. It trusts the audience to feel it, instead of decoding it. That trust is a big shift compared to a lot of modern franchise storytelling, where everything gets explicitly clarified in dialogue or exposition-heavy structure. Here, meaning sits underneath the surface. You're supposed to notice it, not be told it. Another detail that stands out is how often characters are framed in relation to thresholds, doorways, windows, open forest edges, shorelines. It reinforces this idea that they exist between states rather than inside them. Not fully human anymore, not entirely detached either. Always in transition, even when physically still. That's a powerful visual metaphor for emotional liminality. And it fits Twilight better than any grand spectacle ever could. Because the franchise was never really about victory or defeat in the traditional sense. It was about what people become when desire outlives its original context. When love stops being an event and becomes an ongoing condition. When identity stops being flexible and becomes fixed in time. The trailer leans into that condition heavily. There's also a growing sense of emotional distance inside the Cullen family itself that the footage hints at without directly stating. Not conflict in a loud, dramatic sense, but divergence. Different emotional trajectories developing quietly over time. Rosalie, Emmett, Esme, Carlisle, Edward, Bella, they all feel like they've accumulated different relationships with immortality now. Not disagreement, just divergence. And divergence inside a family that cannot age physically creates a unique kind of psychological tension. You don't grow apart through distance. You grow apart through internal change that nobody else can fully track in real time. That's subtle, but deeply human. Even Jacob's presence starts to feel less like a romantic triangle leftover and more like a grounding force tied to humanity itself. He represents something the vampire world no longer fully shares: immediacy, physical life, emotional urgency tied to time limits. And whenever he appears in the trailer, the energy shifts slightly. He feels closer to the audience perspective, which might be intentional. Because Twilight has always existed between two emotional perspectives: the desire to escape humanity, and the quiet realization that humanity gives meaning to everything it touches. That tension is still the core engine here. There's a haunting quality in how the trailer handles sound design too. Instead of constant musical presence, there are long stretches where environmental audio dominates. Wind through trees, rain hitting surfaces, distant human activity fading in and out. It makes the world feel alive, even when characters feel emotionally distant from it. That contrast is where the sadness comes from. Not tragedy in a dramatic sense, but separation. And the more I think about it, the more I realize the trailer isn't really selling a continuation of Twilight's romance mythology. It's selling reflection on what it means to continue at all, to exist after the moment you once believed was the ending, to keep going when the fantasy has already been fulfilled, to live inside the consequences of a dream long after the dreaming stopped. That's a very different emotional promise than the original Saga ever offered. And it might be the first time this franchise has fully grown into what it was always hinting at underneath the surface. Not a love story about becoming immortal, but a long-term emotional study of what immortality does to love over time. What really starts to settle in after watching this trailer a few times is that it's not actually trying to recreate the old Twilight experience at all. It's doing something more uncomfortable than that. It's asking what happens when the emotional memory of a story outlives the version of the people who first experienced it. That's a strange thing for a franchise sequel to attempt. And maybe that's why it feels different from most legacy continuations we've seen in the last decade. It isn't built around the idea of returning to what you loved. It's built around the idea of what has changed in you since you loved it. That's a much more personal question, and it's probably why so many reactions online don't sound like normal trailer breakdowns. People aren't just talking about plot theories or character returns. They're talking about their own lives. That alone tells you the marketing hit something deeper than surface nostalgia. There's a psychological layer to Twilight that always existed, but wasn't always acknowledged openly. It's a story about emotional intensity at a stage in life where everything feels permanent, even when it isn't. First love, first heartbreak, first identity shift, first real encounter with longing that doesn't have a clear resolution. The original films captured that intensity almost accidentally at times. This sequel appears to be intentionally examining it, and that changes everything about how you read even the smallest trailer moments, like Bella looking at Renesmee for too long before responding. That hesitation isn't just dialogue timing. It feels like someone realizing they're now responsible for guiding a version of themselves they no longer fully recognize. Because in a way, that's what children represent in this story. Extensions of choices made in a different emotional era. And immortality complicates that even further. Because parenting normally involves watching someone grow while you also change alongside them. But here, the parent doesn't age. The child does. Emotionally, that creates a disconnect that can never fully resolve itself in a traditional way. That's quietly tragic. Not in a dramatic sense, but in a structural one. There's also a recurring emotional theme in the trailer that feels almost invisible at first, but becomes clearer the more you think about it. The idea of emotional translation failure across time. Characters trying to explain what they feel, but language itself not quite being enough anymore. Edward, for example, often looks like he understands more than he can express without oversimplifying things. Bella looks like she feels more than she can comfortably articulate. Renesmee feels things that don't even have clear emotional vocabulary attached yet, so communication becomes partial, fragmented, incomplete. And that incompleteness builds tension without any need for external conflict. That's actually one of the most mature storytelling choices the trailer hints at. It's not saying they face a new enemy. It's saying they are becoming unable to fully translate themselves to each other over time. That's far more psychologically grounded than most franchise storytelling attempts at depth. Even the way the camera lingers on faces in silence reinforces this idea. It's almost like the film is more interested in internal reactions than external events. Eyes shifting slightly, breathing changing, a glance that lasts half a second too long. Those micro expressions carry more emotional weight than dialogue sometimes, and that's not accidental editing, it's emotional emphasis. Another thing that stands out is how the trailer subtly reframes immortality, not as continuity, but as accumulation. Every experience doesn't replace the previous one. It stacks. It remains present somewhere internally. That creates a kind of emotional density that human life doesn't normally reach in the same way. So characters aren't fresh in any moment anymore. They are layered, and that layering creates emotional complexity that feels almost burdensome at times. You see it in Carlisle especially. There's a sense he is no longer just a moral anchor for the family, but someone carrying centuries of emotional memory that cannot be fully processed or released. That kind of existence raises questions the original Saga never had time to explore deeply. What does emotional healing even mean when nothing ever ends? There's also a subtle but powerful idea running through the trailer about observation versus participation. Immortal characters often feel like observers of human life rather than participants in it. They watch generations pass. They witness cycles repeat. But they are no longer fully inside those cycles. That creates distance. And distance changes empathy over time. Not in a negative way necessarily, but in a way that slowly reshapes emotional response. The trailer seems interested in that transformation quietly. One of the most emotionally striking ideas comes through Renesmee's presence again. She doesn't just represent the next generation, she represents a kind of bridge between participation and observation. She can still potentially choose emotional immediacy, but she is already being shaped by a world where time behaves differently around her. That creates tension not just for her character, but for everyone around her, because she forces others to confront what they have become. There's a brief visual moment where she is standing near a window, watching rain fall, and Bella is behind her in the same frame, but slightly out of focus. That composition alone says something very specific. One is still becoming. The other has already settled into what becoming means for them. And that contrast is where the emotional core of the sequel seems to sit, not in conflict, but in perspective. Different relationships with time existing in the same space. Even the environment reinforces this idea constantly. Weather patterns change, seasons shift, human life continues in predictable cycles, but the vampire characters remain visually unchanged. That contrast becomes more emotionally noticeable the longer you watch the footage, because everything around them moves forward. They don't in the same way, which raises an uncomfortable question the trailer keeps circling without answering directly. Is immortality actually a form of preservation, or is it a form of emotional suspension? That question doesn't need exposition. It just sits there, and it lingers. What's interesting is that none of this feels like a rejection of the original Twilight identity. It feels like an expansion of emotional vocabulary. The same emotional themes, love, longing, identity, transformation, are still present, but they're no longer framed through teenage immediacy. They're framed through accumulated experience. That's why the tone feels heavier, but not darker in a simplistic sense. It feels more aware, more reflective, like a story that has had time to think about itself. And that's probably the most unexpected thing about this trailer overall. It doesn't feel like a reboot trying to modernize an old franchise. It feels like a continuation that finally understands what the original emotional question actually was and is now willing to follow it into adulthood instead of stopping at the fantasy fulfillment point. Because the real question was never, what if love lasted forever? It was always, what does forever do to love? And this trailer finally sits inside that question without rushing to escape it. There's a point where you realize this trailer isn't really trying to sell Twilight in the way modern blockbusters usually sell themselves. It's not pushing scale, it's not pushing mythology expansion, and it's not even pushing nostalgia in a loud, obvious way. It's doing something more unusual. It's trying to sit inside emotional aftermath. And that's a risky place to build a franchise sequel, because aftermath doesn't naturally generate hype in the traditional sense. It generates reflection, sometimes discomfort, sometimes recognition. That's not always something studios are comfortable leading with, especially for a property as globally recognized and heavily memed as Twilight. But that's exactly why this approach stands out. The emotional center of everything we've seen so far keeps circling back to a very simple idea. Nothing about permanence is emotionally static. Even if your body doesn't change, everything around your emotional understanding of existence keeps shifting. People grow, contexts change, meaning changes, and you change in relation to all of it, even if you don't physically age. That's where the trailer's version of Bella becomes especially interesting. She isn't portrayed as someone who has completed her transformation arc. She feels more like someone who has settled into a long-term psychological state that continues evolving in subtle ways. There's a softness in her expressions now that doesn't come from romance alone. It feels like acceptance layered with awareness. Not resignation, but comprehension. Like someone who understands that every choice she made has extended consequences that can no longer be separated from daily existence. That's a very adult emotional framing, and it reframes earlier Twilight decisions in retrospect too. The transformation into immortality, which originally played like the culmination of desire, now reads more like the beginning of a much longer emotional experiment. One that nobody fully understood the cost of at the time. That's why Renesmee's presence feels so structurally important beyond plot mechanics. She isn't just a continuation of the lineage, she represents the long-term echo of that original decision becoming visible in a new form. And what the trailer does cleverly is avoid making her a symbol in a simplistic sense. She doesn't exist to explain immortality to the audience. She exists to experience it differently, which naturally exposes contrasts without needing exposition. That's a much more organic storytelling method. There's also a subtle emotional contrast running through the trailer between motion and stillness. Humans in the world around these characters are constantly in motion, walking, talking, laughing, living through time in a linear way. Meanwhile, the immortal characters often appear frozen in place emotionally, even when they are physically moving. That contrast becomes more noticeable the longer you sit with the footage, and it creates a strange visual rhythm. The world moves forward, but the central characters feel like they are processing movement differently, almost internally buffering reality instead of reacting to it immediately. That's not something you typically see emphasized in franchise storytelling. Another detail that stands out is how the trailer treats silence as something almost physical. Silence isn't just absence of dialogue, it feels like presence, like something occupying space between characters. In one sequence, Bella and Edward are shown walking through a forest without speaking, and the lack of dialogue doesn't feel empty. It feels heavy, like there's too much history between them to reduce to casual conversation anymore, but also no need for constant verbal reaffirmation. That's what long-term emotional bonds often become in real life too. Less explanation, more shared understanding. Shared. Jacob's presence complicates that dynamic in an interesting way as well. He operates emotionally in a different register from the Cullens, and that difference is more pronounced now that everyone has aged into their roles over time. He feels more connected to immediacy, more grounded in physical reality, more responsive to the present moment in a way that contrasts with the slower emotional tempo of Immortals. That contrast isn't framed as conflict in a traditional sense. It's framed as difference in how time is experienced. And that's where the trailer gets quietly philosophical, because it starts suggesting that time doesn't just affect people individually, it shapes how they emotionally interpret reality itself. Two beings can stand in the same place, see the same moment, and experience entirely different emotional meanings from it, based on how they exist within time. That's a deeper idea than most franchise storytelling attempts to explore explicitly. There's also a recurring sense of emotional distance within familiar spaces. The Cullen house, for example, no longer feels like a purely comforting or aspirational location. It feels like a repository of accumulated memory. Beautiful? Yes, but also heavy with history that can't be fully revisited without emotional consequence. That's what long-term memory does to places in real life too. It turns physical environments into emotional archives. And Immortality intensifies that effect because there is no natural reset point. One of the most interesting things about the trailer is how it visually suggests that characters are constantly negotiating between remembering and continuing. Every interaction carries the weight of previous versions of themselves. Every conversation is subtly influenced by everything that came before it. That accumulation creates emotional density, and emotional density replaces narrative urgency as the primary source of tension. That's a sophisticated shift for a franchise continuation. Even the way Renesmee is framed within group scenes reinforces this idea. She often appears slightly apart from others, not necessarily isolated, but positioned as someone whose relationship to time is fundamentally different enough that she can't fully sync emotionally with either humans or immortals yet. That creates a kind of narrative in-between state. And in-between states are where the most interesting emotional storytelling often happens. There's also a thematic thread in the trailer about perception versus permanence. Human life is defined by constant change, which makes each moment feel temporary and therefore emotionally charged. Immortality removes that urgency, but introduces a different kind of emotional complexity. How do you assign meaning to moments that don't end in the same way? The trailer doesn't answer that question. It just keeps returning to it. And that repetition, without resolution, becomes part of the emotional texture. Another thing worth noting is how the trailer avoids overusing iconic musical cues from the original saga. There are faint echoes, subtle references, but nothing overwhelming. That restraint helps the film feel like it exists in continuity rather than repetition. It respects memory without being trapped by it. That's a delicate balance, and the trailer handles it surprisingly well. By the time the footage reaches its final moments, what remains isn't a clear understanding of plot mechanics or villain structures. What remains is emotional impression, a sense of time stretching across characters who no longer experience it the same way. Bella, standing between human memory and immortal existence. Edward, carrying centuries of accumulated emotional continuity. Renesmee, existing at the intersection of both, still forming her understanding of what either side even means. And the world continuing to move around them regardless. That's the emotional architecture the trailer builds. Not a return to Twilight as it was originally experienced, but a continuation of what Twilight becomes after it has been lived with, long enough to change its meaning entirely.